The Ravenswood Ballroom's marble floors echoed with each step as Alexander Beaumont moved through the crowd. The winter wind rattled the tall windows, but inside, the temperature was carefully regulated, like everything else in his world. He caught his reflection in a passing mirror. At 45, his dark hair had gained distinguished streaks of silver, and his tailored tuxedo spoke of wealth earned rather than inherited. The scent of gardenias mixed with expensive perfume filled the air as Toronto's elite mingled beneath the restored ceiling frescoes. Each detail of the annual charity gala had been meticulously planned, from the locally sourced orchid centerpieces to the strategic seating arrangements that placed potential investors near city council members. The Hendersons just arrived. Isabella's voice carried that precise mix of warmth and restraint she'd perfected at finishing school. She appeared at his side, her midnight blue gown making her look more like a carefully curated artwork than his wife of 6 months. At 32, she moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd been groomed for this world since childhood. The string quartet shifted from Mozart to Strauss, the music weaving through conversations about property values and board appointments. Alexander guided Isabella through the crowd, his hand at the small of her back. The gesture looked intimate but felt mechanical, another well-rehearsed move in their choreographed life. Charles. Alexander extended his hand to Henderson, noting the slight hesitation before the older man returned his grip. "The renovations meet with your approval?" Charles Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Spectacular work, though I admit I miss some of the old character." The comment stung more than it should have. Alexander had poured millions into modernizing the Ravenswood, seeing it as his ticket into Toronto's old money circles. "Progress requires balance," he replied smoothly. "Speaking of which, how's the harbor development coming along?" Isabella's diamond bracelet caught the light as she touched his arm, a subtle signal to ease back. She'd become adept at reading his moods, even if she never truly shared them. "Patricia, you must tell me about your trip to Venice," she said, drawing Mrs. Henderson into conversation with practiced ease. But something felt off tonight. Alexander caught snippets of hushed conversations that died as he approached, glances that lingered too long. He'd built his real estate empire by reading rooms and people, and tonight, the air crackled with an undercurrent of anticipation. "The donation total is already past last year's mark," Isabella reported. As they moved toward the stage, "The Children's Hospital Board will be pleased." Alexander nodded, but his attention had snagged on a conversation near one of the marble columns. Can't believe she'd actually come. After everything that happened with them, and in her condition? He forced his focus back to Isabella, to the weight of the speech cards in his pocket. This was their night, their triumph. The past was sealed away, like the original hardwood floors beneath the Ravenswood's new marble. Yet, as he surveyed the glittering crowd, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of their perfectly constructed world. Like the first tremor before a fault line gives way. The moment Alexander saw her, the carefully regulated temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Celeste Rivers stood across the ballroom, her emerald dress setting her apart from the sea of safer colors surrounding her. She was deep in conversation with Julian Montgomery, the city's most prominent art dealer, and everything about her presence felt like a deliberate challenge to the evening's careful orchestration. 5 years had changed her in subtle ways. Her dark hair still fell in waves past her shoulders, but now showed strands of premature gray she hadn't bothered to hide. Her olive skin glowed with a vitality that had nothing to do with expensive facials or carefully applied makeup. But it was her stance that struck him most, a quiet confidence that made her old social polish seem like a costume she'd finally shed. "Alexander." Isabella's voice barely penetrated the roaring in his ears. "The mayor's waiting to discuss the waterfront proposal." He blinked, forcing himself back to the present. Of course. But his eyes kept returning to Celeste, cataloging the changes, the slight fullness in her face, the careful way she held herself. And then, as she turned to laugh at something Julian said, he saw what all those whispered. Conversations had been about the gentle curve of her stomach beneath the artfully draped fabric. The realization hit him with physical force. Pregnant. Celeste was pregnant. "Excuse me," he murmured to Isabella, barely registering her concerned expression. His feet carried him through the crowd on autopilot, muscle memory from countless social events guiding him as his mind raced. Their last conversation echoed in his head, her passionate arguments about environmental impact studies, his cold dismissal of impractical idealism, the sound of her wedding ring hitting his desk as she walked out. He was nearly upon them, when Celeste looked up. The shock in her eyes quickly gave way to something more complex, resignation mixed with a steely determination he'd never seen during their marriage. "Alexander," she said, her voice steady. "I wondered if we'd run into each other." Julian, ever the social tactician, melted away into the crowd. Around them, the party continued its carefully choreographed dance. But Alexander felt suspended in a bubble of tense silence. "You look well," he managed, his usual smoothness deserting him. "I am well." Her hand moved instinctively to rest on her stomach, and the gesture sent a jolt through him. "Very well. Actually." Questions crowded his throat, fighting to be asked. How far along? Who? Why here? Why now? But his carefully constructed world felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse with the wrong breath. "I should congratulate you," Celeste continued, her tone carefully neutral. "On your marriage. Isabella seems exactly what you were looking for." The subtle emphasis made him stiffen. "Thank you. If you'll excuse me, I have a speech to give." But as he turned away, her voice stopped him. "Alexander." He looked back, and for a moment, he saw the woman who'd challenged every assumption he'd ever held about power and success. "We need to talk. Not now, but soon. About several things." The weight of those words followed him back across the ballroom, where Isabella waited with questions in her eyes that he couldn't begin to answer. The string quartet had moved on to Tchaikovsky, but all he could hear was the sound of his carefully ordered world beginning to crack. Celeste watched Alexander retreat, noting how the set of his shoulders betrayed the same tension she'd seen during their final months together. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and she instinctively touched her water glass, the action reminding her how fundamentally her life had changed. The encounter had gone exactly as she'd expected, and nothing like she'd hoped. 5 years of carefully maintained distance, shattered under the unforgiving lights of the Ravenswood. The baby shifted, as if sensing her discomfort, and she took a deep breath. "That looked intense," Julian observed, materializing beside her with the practiced timing of someone who'd navigated social battlefields his entire life. "Are you holding up?" She managed a small smile. "I'm fine. It had to happen eventually." The words tasted like half-truths on her tongue. The memory surfaced unbidden. Their first meeting in this same ballroom, 8 years ago. She'd been fresh from winning her first major environmental case, still believing that passion and truth could change the world. He'd been immediately drawn to her fire, her unwillingness to back down even when faced with his considerable influence. "You're nothing like anyone in my world," he'd told her that night. As they'd stood in this very spot, she'd fallen for his intensity, his drive, the way he seemed to see past her careful defenses. The marriage had been a whirlwind, and its collapse equally sudden. His ambition, once magnetic, had become all-consuming. Her environmental causes became inconvenient to his business interests. The Henderson Wetlands project had been the final straw. Pristine habitat sacrificed for luxury condos. Their arguments had grown bitter, personal. "You knew who I was when you married me," he'd said in that last fight. "I didn't change, you did." Now, watching him command the room's attention for his speech, Celeste felt the truth of those words differently. They had both changed, and perhaps they had both stayed exactly the same. Dr. Marcus Bennett moved through the crowd toward her, his presence bringing a wave of calm. He was everything Alexander wasn't, brilliant but humble, successful but grounded. Their connection had developed slowly over shared concerns about urban healthcare access, healing rather than consuming. "I heard Beaumont's back in the room," Marcus said quietly, his hand finding hers. "Want to leave?" Before she could answer, Isabella Beaumont appeared beside them, elegant and composed. "The speech will be starting soon," she said, her voice carrying no hint of the tension surely coursing through her. "I believe you'll want to hear this one, Celeste." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken complications. Then Celeste saw something in the younger woman's eyes, not hostility, but a kind of recognition. Actually, so Celeste replied, I think we all need to hear it. Isabella Beaumont had spent her entire life learning to read between lines, to see the truth beneath carefully constructed surfaces. As she watched her husband approach the podium, she caught the subtle signs of his unraveling, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted the microphone, the barely noticeable tightness around his mouth. The revelation of Celeste's presence and condition had torn through their carefully orchestrated evening like a stone through stained glass. From her position near the stage, Isabella could see both her husband and his ex-wife, their mutual awareness creating an almost visible current between them. The Ravenswood has always been more than just a building, Alexander began, his voice steady, despite the strain Isabella could see in his jaw. It's a symbol of our city's commitment to preserving what matters while embracing necessary change. The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. 6 months of marriage had taught her Alexander's tells, and tonight, they were all on display. The crowd listened attentively, playing their parts in this social theater. But beneath the surface, whispers were already circulating. Did you see Celeste Rivers, the environmental lawyer, carrying Bennett's child? Isabella accepted a fresh champagne from a passing server, needing its warmth. The glass felt cool against her palm, grounding her as her world shifted beneath her feet. She'd known about Celeste, of course, had done her research when she'd first started dating Alexander. The society pages had painted a picture of passion and scandal, but seeing her in person revealed something the papers had missed, an authenticity that made Isabella's own carefully curated life feel suddenly hollow. The future of Toronto depends on balance, Alexander continued, each word weighted with unintended meaning, between preservation and progress, between tradition and innovation. Isabella's gaze drifted to where Celeste stood with Marcus Bennett, their quiet intimacy more genuine than anything she'd experienced in her carefully arranged marriage. The pregnancy suited her, bringing a glow that had nothing to do with expensive skincare or strategic lighting. You're handling this with remarkable grace, came a quiet voice. Julian Montgomery had appeared at her side, his artistic sensibility, always attuned to the undercurrents of social drama. Grace is what we're taught, isn't it? Isabella replied, surprising herself with her candor. Along with proper table settings and how to deflect uncomfortable questions at charity functions. Julian studied her thoughtfully. And what were we taught about authenticity? The question hit harder than she expected. Before she could respond, Alexander's voice rose for his conclusion. With your continued support, the Ravenswood will remain a testament to what we can achieve when we honor our past while building our future. The applause was appropriately enthusiastic, the crowd performing their expected roles. But as Isabella watched her husband descend from the stage, she saw him clearly for perhaps the first time, a man so focused on crafting the perfect image that he'd forgotten how to be real. The orchestra began a waltz, and couples moved on to the dance floor. Alexander approached her, ever mindful of appearances, but Isabella held up a hand to stop him. We need to talk, she said softly, echoing words spoken earlier by another. Woman, not here, not now, but soon. About what? His question carried an edge of defensive irritation. About whether we're preserving something worth saving, she answered, or just maintaining an elaborate facade. The music swelled around them, but the space between them had never felt wider. The Ravenswood's historic library still smelled of leather and old paper, despite the renovation. Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching snow begin to fall outside. The party continued in the main ballroom, but here, in the quiet, the carefully constructed walls of his life were finally beginning to crumble. The door opened softly. He didn't need to turn to know it was Celeste. He recognized the sound of her steps, even after 5 years. Some things don't change, she said, moving to stand near him, but not too close. You still retreat? To libraries when things get complicated. And you still follow me when I do. He turned to face her, noting how the room's warm lighting softened her features, though I suppose that's not your role anymore. Celeste rested a hand on her stomach, the gesture unconscious but profound. No, it's not. But we need to have this conversation, and we both know it. The sound of the party filtered through the heavy doors, music, laughter, the continuous performance of privilege and power. Everything he'd spent his life pursuing. Everything that suddenly felt hollow. Marcus Bennett, he said, the name tasting bitter. I wouldn't have expected that. Because he works with underserved communities. Because he chose medicine over money. A familiar fire sparked in her eyes. Or because he sees me as more than an accessory to his ambitions. The truth of her words stung. Before he could respond, the door opened again. Isabella stood, there, elegant and composed, with Marcus Bennett beside her. The four of them regarded each other in loaded silence. I think, Isabella said finally, we all need to stop pretending. Spring came early to Toronto that year. 3 months after the Ravenswood Gala, Alexander sat in his downtown office, watching construction crews work on the community health center being built where the Henderson luxury condos were supposed to be. The morning's paper lay open on his desk, a photo of Isabella in Paris, standing proudly beside her first gallery showing. Their divorce had been finalized last week, marked not by acrimony but by mutual recognition of a truth they'd both been avoiding. His phone buzzed with a message from Celeste. A photo of a newborn girl, wrapped in soft pink. Charlotte. Marcus Bennett. 7LB 6 Oz. Both of us are doing well. The warmth that spread through his chest surprised him. Not jealousy or regret, but genuine happiness for the woman who had once shared his life and had found the courage to build a better one. The Ravenswood project had taken an unexpected turn. Instead of the exclusive social club he'd planned, it would now house a mixed-use space, part community center, part environmental research facility, part arts venue. The decision had shocked Toronto's elite, but for the first time in his career, Alexander found their opinions mattered less than doing what was right. His assistant knocked, entering with the morning's mail. Among the business correspondence was a handwritten note from Isabella. Dear Alexander, Paris is everything I needed it to be. I'm painting again. Something I'd forgotten I loved. Yesterday, I sold my first piece. It's not much, but it's real. I hope you're finding your own way to be real too. With warmth, Isabella. He placed the note carefully in his desk drawer, next to the old photo from his and Celeste's wedding. Not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as markers of how far he'd come. Later that afternoon, he had a meeting, scheduled with an environmental conservation group, the kind of organization he would have dismissed without a second thought just months ago. But the night of the gala had changed more than just his marriage. It had cracked open the carefully constructed shell of his life, letting in light that illuminated truths he'd long ignored. Standing at his office window, Alexander watched the city below. Construction crews worked on the health center, a project now jointly funded by his company and Marcus Bennett's medical group. Nearby, protesters gathered peacefully to oppose another developer's wetland project. Among them, he spotted Celeste, now visibly recovered from childbirth, speaking passionately to the crowd. His phone buzzed again, another photo from Marcus, this one showing Celeste holding Charlotte while addressing the protesters. The message read, "Thought you'd want to see this. She's still changing the world, just with better priorities." Alexander smiled, recognizing in their happiness not what he had lost, but what he had gained, the freedom to finally become real. The spring sun climbed higher over Toronto, promising another day full of possibilities. In the light of this new dawn, Alexander straightened his tie and prepared to step into a world where power was measured not in appearances, but in the courage to be authentically oneself. The Ravenswood ballroom sparkled once again, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. Gone were the stilted conversations and calculated networking. Instead, the room buzzed with genuine excitement as a diverse crowd mingled. Environmental activists chatted with business leaders. Artists shared ideas with city planners, and healthcare workers discussed community needs with developers. Alexander stood near the restored fireplace, surveying the scene with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The past year had been one of profound change, both personally and professionally. His company had shifted focus, prioritizing sustainable development and community-oriented projects. It hadn't been easy. He'd lost some investors and faced skepticism from old allies. but the rewards had been immeasurable. "Quite a different crowd from last year," came a familiar voice. Celeste approached, looking relaxed in a simple green dress, a stark contrast to the formal gown she'd worn at the previous gala. Alexander nodded, smiling. "I think that's a good thing." "It is," she agreed. "Charlotte's with my parents tonight," she added, anticipating his question. "Marcus is making the rounds, talking up the new health initiative." They stood in comfortable silence, the awkwardness of their past having given way to a tentative friendship built on shared goals and mutual respect. "I saw Isabella's latest show online," Celeste said after a moment. "She's really found her voice." "She has," Alexander replied, warmth in his tone. "Paris suits her. She's coming back next month for the opening of her Toronto gallery." The sound of a gentle chime rang through the room, calling attention to the small stage. Julian Montgomery stepped up to the microphone, his artistic flair evident in his vibrant suit. "Welcome, everyone, to the first annual Ravenswood Community Forum," he began. "A year ago, this building stood as a symbol of exclusivity. Today, it represents what can happen when we break down barriers and work together." As Julian continued, outlining the evening's events and introducing the various community leaders present, Alexander felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Marcus, who had made his way through the crowd. "Thought you'd want to see this," Marcus said, handing over his phone. On the screen was an email from the city council, confirming the approval of a major wetland restoration project, the very one Celeste had been protesting a year ago. Alexander looked up, meeting Celeste's eyes. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. They had once built a life together based on ambition and social climbing. Now, separated but connected by a shared vision, they were building something far more meaningful. "We should join the others," Celeste said softly, gesturing towards where Marcus stood with a group of community organizers. As they moved through the crowd, Alexander caught snippets of conversations, discussions about affordable housing initiatives, debates on sustainable urban planning, excitement over new public art projects. The energy in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the carefully controlled atmosphere of Galis past. Near the refreshment table, he spotted a familiar face, Charles Henderson, looking slightly out of place but engaged in deep conversation with an environmental scientist. "So Alexander," Charles greeted him, a newfound respect in his tone. "Your team's proposal for the harbor development is impressive. I never thought I'd say this, but you might be onto something with this green infrastructures approach." Alexander smiled, remembering how he once would have done anything for Charles's approval. Now, it was just one small validation in a much larger, more important journey. As the evening wound down, Alexander found himself back near the windows, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The Ravenswood stood as a bridge between old and new, much like he himself had become, honoring the past while embracing a more authentic, purposeful future. A year ago, in this very room, his carefully constructed world had begun to crumble. Now, standing amid the vibrant energy of real connection and shared purpose, Alexander realized he hadn't lost an empire. He'd gained a community. The soft notes of a piano filled the air, not a formal waltz, but a gentle jazz piece that invited casual swaying and easy conversation. Alexander loosened his tie, took a deep breath, and turned to rejoin the gathering. The night was young, the future was bright, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, vibrantly alive. What did you think of the story? Leave a comment and a review about this story. If you were moved and enjoyed our work, feel free to help us continue producing. I invite you to click on our link in the first pinned comment. Now, 2 buttons will appear, one to subscribe if you haven't already, and the other to watch other interesting stories. Choose one. Thank you for watching this far. See you soon.